I have a jokes app here that lists a bunch of jokes, and each joke has a like button and a dislike button that should increase the likes or decrease the likes and show the total number of likes for each joke. But for this to work, I need to use useState. So in this video, I'm going to show you how useState works. So this is my application. I have a joke component that accepts an ID and some text. I have two event handlers here, one for liking and one for disliking. And then this component just displays the text, the likes, and two buttons for liking or disliking. Then in my app component, I have an array of jokes, and each of those is rendered using that joke component. So right now we can see that on the page, and if I open up DevTools and zoom in a lot, we'll be able to see the console logs that happen every time I try and like or dislike each of these jokes. So if we go back and look at the joke component, we can see that the likes is just hard-coded in there as a 0. So the first thing we might try to do is actually turn this into a variable in JavaScript. So I'm going to create a likes variable up here that defaults to 0. And then anytime we like this, we could just increment the total number of likes. And if we dislike it, we can decrement the total number of likes. And then we could also console log this out here. So like for this joke, total likes is likes. And then I'll do the same for decreasing the likes. So this looks like it should work. JavaScript variable, I'm increasing it or decreasing it, and we're rendering that number to the screen here. So let's see what happens now when we try liking or disliking. So if I like the first joke, in the console I can see that we're liking the first joke and the total number of likes is 1, and I can keep going up here, 2, 3, 4. So it now has 5 likes for the first joke, and I can do that with the second joke too. So the logic seems to be working here, but we don't actually see that count appear on the component, even though that variable that is being console logged here is the same variable that we're using to render that total number of likes. And this is because React isn't re-rendering this component when that variable changes. So we need to tell React that every single time we update this likes variable, it needs to re-render that component to the screen. But then if React re-renders each joke, it's going to recall this function. And if it calls this function again, it's going to reset likes to be 0 because we defined it right here. And I don't really want to take the likes variable out of the component because it is specific to each joke that is on the screen. So I need this to be created for each joke that is created so that each joke gets its own like count. So there's a couple of problems here that can all be solved by using the useState hook. And we can use this by importing it from React, useState from React. And then instead of initializing likes to 0, I'm going to initialize it to the return value of useState, and I'll pass in 0 as the default value. And this actually returns an array with 2 items in it. So we can destructure that array, and the first one I'll call likes, and the second thing I will call set likes. And this will actually be a const, not a let. Then every time we update likes, instead of updating this variable, I'll call the setLikes function. So I'll just set likes to be likes plus 1, or set likes to be likes minus 1. And now, with all of these changes, we should see that the like count increases or decreases on the screen here every single time I update that state. But let's talk about how this actually works. So the first thing we're doing is importing this useState hook. And hooks are special functions in React that let you do some special things. They're named with the word use in front of them, and there's a few different ones. useState is probably the most common, but there's also things like useEffect that you will definitely use context, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. We're just going to focus on useState for now, but these are special React things. A normal function in JavaScript won't maintain any state between calls. So joke is a normal JavaScript function, and this function can be called many times by React. And we need to keep track of this like count, which is some state that is managed by this function. But functions don't really have any mechanism for keeping track of state like this. So by using the useState hook, React is actually going to keep track of the state for us And even though it can call this function multiple times, React will just know what the value of likes should be, and we'll be able to use that value within the component. So useState is asking React to maintain this state for us. So we call the useState function and we pass in an initial value. This is the value that the variable likes will have the very first time this component is rendered. So for a like count, I just want that to be 0, but a lot of the time this will just be any bottom value. So it could be an empty string or an empty array. Those are all common things, but really this can be almost any JavaScript value. So I'll set this back to 0. And this function returns an array with 2 items in it. And the reason it does that is so we can write syntax like this, where we can create 2 variables very easily, separated by a comma, and we can name them whatever we want. So the first variable we usually name to be the thing that the variable would be if we weren't using useState. So I'd already called this likes, or maybe like count would be a good one too, but this is whatever variable name you would give to the piece of state that you're keeping track of. Then the second thing is going to be that name, but with set in front of it because it is a function. So the first thing is the actual value that we're keeping track of, and the second thing is a function to update that value. And there's a very important rule here that we never ever update or mutate the value directly. We always use this setter function to update the state. So within these functions, I'm using setLike to update the value of likes, but I'm never updating likes directly, and that's one of the reasons I use const here. But then when it comes time to rendering the likes, I just access that variable directly, and when I'm updating the likes here, I can still read that data. I would just never update that data directly. And if we go back to the app here, I'm actually gonna refresh this page so we get a clean console, and I'm gonna click the like button twice here, and I can see that this now has 2 likes, which is exactly what I want. And if we look at the console, we can see we're liking the first joke here, but the first time this was called, we got a total likes of 0, and the second time it was 1. And if I keep clicking this button, it's always going to be 1 behind this like count, which is kind of weird because I'm updating that state on line 8 and then doing the console log on line 9. So I am updating that like count, and we can see the result of that on the screen here. I have 3 likes there. But this console log doesn't seem to know that the current like count has been updated. And this is because state updates are actually asynchronous. So we're telling React that we want this state to be updated and that it should re-render this component. But React won't actually update this variable until the re-render happens. So I could even do something stupid, like call this over and over again. Let's call it 4 times, which you might expect to increase the like count by 4. But if I go back to the application here and click the like button, it's still only going to happen once. And the reason that's happening is because every time we call setLike, we're using the current value of likes. So the first time this is called, likes would be 0. So setting likes to 0 plus 1 will be 1, and then we just do the exact same thing over and over again because this value has not been updated since the previous state update. And one of the reasons React does this is for efficiency. So even though I'm updating state 4 times here, it's only going to cause 1 re-render within React. But if my intent was to update the state 4 times here, then this isn't going to work. But these setter functions accept a value, or they accept a callback function. So if I pass this a callback function, it might look something like this, where the only parameter that gets passed into the function is the current value of the likes. And then we return whatever we want that new value to be. But if I do this now 4 times, instead of doing it the old way, every time these callback functions get called, it's going to pass in the current value of the state. So now if we go back to the app, and I'm going to refresh so we start at 0, if I click the like button, I will get 4 likes here because all of those callback functions are going to be past the most updated version of the state. But most of the time, this syntax is unnecessary. There's a few cases where you'll need to pass in a callback function. So for the most part, people generally just like to pass in the value that is needed, and that's all we need in this case. And if I really cared about my console log being up to date with my actual state, I could just take this out here and put it in a different variable. Maybe I call it new likes. And then I'm going to update the state to be this new count, and then I get to use this variable within my function if I wanted to for a console log or for something else like that. So now every time I like, my console log is up to date with my current state. And you can add as many state variables as you want to a component. So instead of just keeping track of likes, I'm going to keep track of dislikes as well. So handling likes will increment the likes, and handling dislikes will increment dislikes. And then to get the total likes down here, it will be dislikes minus likes, which means the behavior should still be the same. No, I got this the wrong way round. So liking actually dislikes it. Likes goes on the left minus dislikes. Okay. But there we go. So we're keeping track of multiple pieces of state there, and every single time some state gets updated, it causes a re-render of that component. And notice how the state is private to each component. So each joke component gets its own version of the likes and dislikes state, so we can keep track of those independently of each other, even though they are the same component. Now let's say I want to be able to favorite a joke. So I'm going to add a new button in here. I'm going to call this favorite. And when we click on this, let's see, pass in a handle favorite function. I'll define that function. I'm not going to do anything in there just yet. And I want a piece of state called favorite, set favorite. That is going to be a Boolean value. And when we favorite a joke, I'm just going to set this to true. Oh, actually, yeah, we can set it to not favorite. So favorite will start as false, and then if we call this function, it will set it to true, and then if we call it again, it would set it to false, and it will always just flip that Boolean value. And then down here, I'll add another p tag, and I'll just say it's my favorite joke. If favorite is true, we'll pass in yes. Otherwise, no, capitalize Objective-C style. Okay, so neither of these are my favorite joke, but then if I click the favorite button here, it's yes. And then if I click the favorite button here, it's also yes. And then if I click it again, it's no. But there is an issue here because I only want to be able to favorite one joke. So let's say the first joke was my only favorite. If I click the favorite button on the second joke, it should set this to yes, but this to no. And this requires sharing state between my two joke components. But they're completely separate. They don't know about each other. I'm rendering them by using a map here in app.jsx, but they don't communicate with each other. They are independent of each other. So if I want to share data between my two joke components, I'm going to need to store that state in the app component because that's the component that knows about both of the jokes. So I'm going to go into joke and I'm going to take out this favorite state. And I'm going to move this into app.jsx, and usually we put state at the very top of the component. So I put that up there. I also need to import useState into app now. And then instead of this being a Boolean, I'm going to have it be the ID of the joke. So maybe I'll default this to the first joke. The first joke by default is my favorite. And then what I'm going to do is use this state to pass in a Boolean value as props here. So I'm going to say that this joke is my favorite if the favorite piece of state up here is equal to the joke's ID. So right now, since the favorite is 1, the first joke will be my favorite. And then back in the joke component, I'm going to accept favorite as a prop here. And this will still be a Boolean. App is passing it in as a Boolean value, so this logic can stay the same. But when I click on that favorite button, the joke isn't going to handle setting that state anymore. That's going to be part of app.jsx. So instead of calling set favorite here, I'm going to accept another prop. I'll call this on favorite maybe. And I'm going to call this within my handle favorite function. So I'll call that and I'll pass in the ID. So now I need app to pass in a function using the onFavorite prop that will get called when I click this button down here, and it will pass in that ID. So I'll take that, pass it in here. We got onFavorite, and this needs to equal a function. So I'm going to create a function. I'll just call this handle favorite, where we get the ID. We can then in this function set the state on app.jsx to be the ID that was passed in. And that's actually all we need. So I'm going to pass that in here. There we go. So now we have this favorite state on app, which is defaulting to 1. We say that a joke is a favorite when the ID equals that piece of state. When the joke component calls the onFavorite callback function here, we're just going to update the state to be the ID that was passed in from joke. So this should all work exactly as I want it to now. I'm just going to clear the console. So the first one defaults to be the favorite. And then if I click the second one, that one is now the favorite, and the first one is no longer the favorite, and I can go back and forth here. And if I click the favorite button more than once, it does nothing, because it's just setting that state to be the ID of the joke that was clicked. So setting that state to be the same value over and over again just won't do anything. So the way to share state between two components is to move that state into the parent component and then pass that state down to the children using props. Now I want to create a new form component in here so that I can create new jokes, call this joke form, and add them to that array of jokes that I have. So I'm going to export a default function here, call it joke form, and this should return a form. So I'll create a form in here that has an onSubmit event, and I'll create a new function to handle that submit, print default, and we'll just leave it like that for now. Then I'm going to have a single input in here. Then I'm going to have a single input in here. And a button to submit that form. And let's actually just see what this looks like so far. So I'll add a joke form to my app. There we go, enter a joke and submit. That's good enough. So when this joke form gets submitted here, I want it to pass the data that is typed in here, whatever joke is typed in here. I want it to pass that up from the form component into app.jsx so that app can add it to this array of jokes. So in order to do that, I'll need a function here called maybe handle new joke. And I need this to be passed down into the joke form. So we'll say on new joke equals handle new joke. So this is just a callback function that the joke form will call. And for this to work, we need on new joke to be defined as a prop in the joke form. And it should call this function when it's submitted. Now, it needs to call this function with whatever data I pass in here. So right now it's just this jargon, but it should be a real joke. So we want to keep track of whatever a user types into this input field. And a really common way of doing that in React is to use state for this. So I'm going to create a new piece of state, and I'll just call this text because it's the text the user's putting in. And again, we need to import useState from React. And every time this input changes, so in the onChange event, we're going to pass it a function. And in that function, we're going to set the text, update that state to be the e.target.value. So whatever value that input field has, we're going to store in this state variable. And then we can use this and pass it to the parent component here. So when this changes, we update the state variable, and then we pass that value up to the app component in this handle new joke function. So this is going to be the joke text. And I'm just going to console log this out for now. Just new, oh, there we go, new joke text, new joke text. So back in the browser, let's a new joke, submit that, and I can see the new joke is a new joke right there. So this is working so far. It is passing the data up to the app component. But one of the benefits of using state to keep track of whatever's put into this input field is we can also pass the state in as the value. So if I say the value of this input field is whatever the value of this state is, then if we update text another way, the input field will always show whatever the value of text is. And the use case we might want this for is that if someone submits a new joke, I can then go ahead and set the text to be an empty string, which will clear the form for us. So now if I go back and submit a joke, it will call that function in the app component, but it will also clear out this form. So say another joke, it passes that data up to app and then clears the form for us. And any form you create in React will usually manage state like this in some way. So now that the joke data is being passed up to app.jsx, we need to put this into the array of jokes and then have that render the new joke onto the screen. But that involves storing the array in state and manipulating the array as a state variable, which I'm going to cover in my next video. So make sure you subscribe and don't miss that video or any future videos that I post.